It's been estimated that Dr. DeBakey was involved in training over 1,000 surgeons during his lifetime. All of these surgeons have stories to tell. Stories about their training, about Baylor, Methodist Hospital, Ben Taub, but most importantly about Dr. DeBakey himself. Today we have three important DeBakey trainees: Dr. George Noon, Dr. Charlie McCullum, and Dr. Ken Maddox. These three individuals not only trained at Baylor, but later served on the faculty of the Department of Surgery and continue to serve in that capacity. What an honor. My name is Roger Gregory, and together with Dr. Jimmy Yao, Walt McCarthy, and Richard Lynn, we will be conducting this interview about stories and tales of their times at Baylor with Dr. DeBakey. The tour of the DeBakey Museum has now been completed, and we are adding some additional time to discuss Dr. DeBakey in more depth with a personal view and insight from Dr. George Noon, Dr. Ken Maddox, and Dr. Charlie McCullum. Dr. Maddox, Dr. Noon, and Charlie McCullum probably knew Dr. DeBakey better than anyone who is still alive. We'd like to start with some questions for discussion directed primarily at Dr. George Noon, the modest and private Houston surgeon, unlike most Houston icons. George, give us your personal insights about what it was like to operate with Dr. DeBakey. You did a transition from being a surgery resident and trainee under Dr. DeBakey to being on staff, and then finally you were Dr. DeBakey's surgeon. What was that like, George? How did that happen?
Being Dr. DeBakey's surgeon?
No. Yes. Well, how did that transition happen from being his trainee to transitioning up to being his surgeon?
It took 40 years.
Well, I mean, so this was sort of a gradual event. George, if you don't mind, could you talk to us a little bit about the surgery?
What happened was that Dr. DeBakey, while he was working in his library at home, developed a sudden pain in the upper chest and it got radiating up into his neck. And he made a diagnosis, but didn't tell anybody at first that it was a dissecting aneurysm.
He made the diagnosis?
He made the diagnosis.
Okay.
And when he called us in to evaluate him, at first he wouldn't go to the hospital, he stayed at home. And we finally got him over to the hospital to do a CT scan, which showed a 5.5 centimeter aneurysm of the ascending aorta. We didn't see a definite dissection, but there was an intramural hematoma in that. And then we followed it up with further scans, and then about a month later, his aneurysm had increased to a size of 7.5 centimeters, and he had a pericardial effusion, and things were looking pretty dim as far as a aneurysm nearing rupture.
So he did have a pericardial effusion then, too?
Yes, he did. He had a pericardial. And that day that he had that scan, there was an abnormality that showed up on the brain. It looked like he had an intracranial hemorrhage. I talked to the family and told them that if we were going to do anything surgically, we'd have to do it. But we couldn't really do anything if he had a brain hemorrhage, and we had to study that, which showed it was just an artifact, and there was no evidence of any brain hemorrhage. So the family wanted to go ahead with operation. Went down and talked to anesthesia and told them what was going on, and they were going to get set up to be his anesthesia, give him his anesthesia. And after a while, they came up to the room and said, "We decided we're not going to give him any anesthesia. We're not going to be his anesthesiologist. We don't think he should be operated on him."
Wow.
So we did some hunting around and found someone who would do the anesthesia, and it was an anesthesia that actually worked in the department, who was a friend of DeBakey. And then they developed a committee to evaluate whether we could go ahead. and there were about 6 people in that room. And this was started all about 10 o'clock in the morning. Now we're getting about 10 o'clock at night. And the ethics committee was deliberating, and his family was waiting to get the results of their deliberation. But after a while, they got tired, and his wife burst into the room where they were meeting and said, "Listen, we got to move, and you're killing my husband." And he's had enough of this ethics committee. And
why was an ethics committee brought in, George?
Because anesthesia didn't feel like they wanted to do the operation.
Was it because of his age, George?
Because of his age, yeah.
Well, he wasn't but, what, 97?
Right, he was 97 years old.
It didn't matter what Dr. DeBakey wanted?
But another part of that story is that one of his internists that was taking care of him was pushing him one day about whether or not he wanted to be resuscitated if he had a rest. And he kept bugging DeBakey, and DeBakey got, I guess you can say he got pissed. And he said, "Okay, I'll sign the paper." But in talking to Dr. DeBakey, I asked him, if something comes up and you're unable to give us an answer of what you would like to be done or what would accept, what do you want me to do? He said, "I want you to do the right thing." We thought the right thing was to operate on him.
Okay.
So after we got out of the ethics committee meeting, it was close to midnight, and we started operating and operated all night, and we replaced his ascending aorta. You had to use total cardiopulmonary bypass, of course, and profound hypothermia.
George, what was the operation like?
Well,
I mean, it was just like everything you'd ever seen before with an ascending dissector.
As well as I do, that's what you're trained to do, and you do the best you can, and hope everything turns out okay. But I mean, as far as the operation, it was a routine for that type of aneurysm, but it wasn't routine as far as who was being operated upon.
Was the valve okay, George?
The valve was okay. Well, we suspended the valve, and so that was okay.
And the coronaries were fine?
Well, the thing about the coronaries, he had some marginal renal dysfunction, and we never did a cath on him. He had no evidence of coronary artery disease by any other criteria, but they didn't have a cath on him.
Right. So you got out of the operating room, and how did you do post-op?
Well, he had a slow but complete recovery except for muscle weakness, and so he was, at the end, brain-wise was always okay. In fact, he's better than the rest of us.
Still better than the rest of us.
Yeah.
Well, George, that must have been a difficult and exciting time for you and for everybody else taking care of Dr. DeBakey.
One thing they've asked Dr. DeBakey many times after the operation if he was glad that we went ahead and did the operation, and he was glad, and he said if he hadn't done that operation, I wouldn't be getting that award up there from President Bush.
He's very proud of that award.
He is. Right.
So. Now, leaving Dr. DeBakey's operation, you went with Dr. DeBakey on many international trips to do surgery on very impressive or important people. In general, George, let's start with Russia. Could you comment on when you went to Russia with Dr. DeBakey on I know you've talked to me about this before, so if you wouldn't mind commenting again when you and Dr. DeBakey operated on the President of Science in Russia, could you comment on the facilities and monitoring and anesthesia and instruments and what support staff you had?
The invitation, I guess you can call it an invitation, to Dr. DeBakey was to come and operate on Akademician Keldysh, who was the head of the scientists of the Soviet Union. And so when we went over there, we took all of the instruments and the things that we thought we would need for the operation, just in case they didn't have them. And it was a good thing that we did take them, because they didn't have a lot of things that we needed. One of the things that we took a nurse, a scrub nurse, and we took another person, circulating nurse, which happened to be my wife, who'd never been in an operating room before.
Oh, I didn't know that, George.
Yeah.
Wow.
So about 2 weeks before we went, she went and spent every day in the operating room learning how to circulate, and she did a great job.
I'm sure she did. Now, what did you do in the operation?
Well, first thing we did was get arteriograms with a translumbar and bilateral femoral arteriograms, and it showed that he had aortic occlusive disease and bilateral superficial femoral occlusions. So we did a bypass from the abdominal aorta to both external iliac arteries and bilateral femoral popliteal bypasses. He did a sympathectomy and finished it off with a cholecystectomy.
Yeah. Had to top it off.
One of the things that happened during the operation was that as we were harvesting the saphenous vein, the Russian surgeon that was helping us was pulling a little bit too hard, and the vein just ripped in two. If that had happened in the operating room in Houston, Texas, you would have heard a yell all around the United States. But happening over there, he couldn't really yell, and you can see that his jugular veins get big. Anyway, that worked out okay. We sewed it together, and it worked fine.
Now, what happened immediately post-op, George?
Well, immediately post-op, what happened was they had a brunch upstairs for everyone to go to, and Dr. DeBakey and the rest of the crew went up there, and I stayed down for a while in the operating room. Where we were recovering him in the operating room. And I stayed down there, and then they kept coming, wanted me to go up there. So finally I went up there, and I was up there for a while, and I just had a funny feeling. I said, I better go check and see what's going on down there. I went down there and looked in the room, and he looked like a corpse. His blood pressure dropped down. He got hypothermic, and the monitor that we brought over from Houston was they changed the gain on it, so the blood pressure looked like it was okay. But we resuscitated him, and everything ended up working okay, and we aborted our trip to Siberia. And fortunately, he did well.
Now, you also at least were a supervisor or consultant with President Yeltsin.
Right.
What was that about, George, in 1996?
Well, he had presented with coronary disease and heart failure, and probably too much alcohol. And they called Dr. DeBakey to evaluate him to see whether or not he should be operated upon because of his coronary disease. And so he went over there and looked at it, and he did have operable disease, but he recommended that they wait and get him in better condition before they did the operation, and which we did. And he had his hypothyroidism and some other problems, which were treated over about 3 months' time. And then at the time that we went ahead to operation, we came over from Houston, and we brought all our stuff. I took left ventricular assist devices, balloon, centrifugal pumps, etc., so that we had all those available if we needed them.
Would they let y'all scrub, or?
Well, we didn't scrub. We were in the operating room. We did not scrub. And the operation was done by Ronat Arturian, who's a Russian surgeon who we had worked with and had been over here before. So he did the actual surgery. We were there in case there was any problems.
And what about other locations, South America, or other areas in Europe and Middle East and so forth? Did you go with Dr. DeBakey in any of those places?
We were in Hungary. Actually, after we operated on Keldysh, we went to Hungary and operated there, and that was in the mid-'70s on a princess who wasn't really considered a princess by the regime that was in charge at that time, and operated in Belgium with him.
Were the circumstances and facilities pretty good there, or once again, did you bring everything with you? Or?
We brought a lot, but no, they one of the problems they had, where you're asking about Russia, was that whoever got the suitcase first or the trunk first got first choice, and you may not, if you're at the end, you didn't have anything left to work with. And so even though something arrived in Russia and it's coming directed toward the Institute, it may never make it.
Right. So what was Dr. DeBakey like to operate with on a regular basis, George?
He was what you call an exacting surgeon, a demanding surgeon. He wanted everything to turn out right.
Would you say that, how did you get along with him so well in the operating room? I know you did, but how did that happen?
Do a good job.
Well, that would probably help a lot, I'm sure. Ken, the life of Dr. DeBakey, just particularly from going through the museum yesterday, demonstrated a giant breadth of person. As Dr. Oshner, John Oshner said, Dr. DeBakey was the only physician in history whose name was a household word. Before discussing the multiple areas of his persona and career, how do you think this all came about? How did Dr. DeBakey happen? I know I asked George about this one time, and George said, oh, well, he was just a genius. Charlie said the same thing. So brain power had a lot to do with it. Ability to focus. I know I'd never seen anybody with such intensity and energy. What do you think his time management secrets were? And one thing he said to me about Rudolph Mattis, when I asked him why was Dr. Mattis so great, he said it was curiosity. Do you think the same held true for Dr. DeBakey?
I don't think Dr. DeBakey's management style he thought about. But he had the capability of shifting from management style to management style almost instantaneously, changing moods from the operating room to the consultation room to the boardroom to recruitment or even to raising money. And you would, if you went with him, you would see a total different person. Most of us don't have that ability to shift gears so quickly. I think this was an innate, inbred, inborn characteristic that he did not go to school for. It just happened. Now, part of this is his tremendous focus on the utilization of time. He did not want to waste a minute or a second. So he was trying to utilize time, and therefore he was able to dismiss the last issue, moving to a new issue, and deal particularly with that issue and the function, the outcome, the objective of that new meeting. And he wouldn't spend sometimes very long and go to now another task. So this management style, he had the capability of shift.
What about this slogan that I kept hearing again and again, and particularly from you guys that stayed with on the faculty, attention to detail? I'm sure you never heard that said but thousands of times.
With lots of phrases, but two that I heard a lot: attention to detail and pursuit of excellence. And both of those, he were sort of a cheerleading phrase that he gave to all students, all residents, all faculty. And he had that attention, and he wanted everyone else to have that same attention and not leave anything out. He often would say, do you have your list of things to do? And long before we had checklists, he would ask us, where's your checklist? And write it down. If you don't write it down, you're going to forget it.
Ken, I was reading about Dr. DeBakey and meeting him. I wondered what you thought gave him the intensity to live his life the way he did. I mean, what in his background gave him the drive to do so much in so many different areas?
Again, I think it's a lot of it's genetic. If you look at what his parents did, they're settling in America. They're settling in Lake Charles, Louisiana. His father was a pharmacist. His father wanted to make sure all of his 6 children had a good education. And each of those children had attention to detail, had pursuit of excellence, and when you talk to his brother, who was a surgeon in Mobile, Alabama, when you particularly talk to Lois and Selma DeBakey, who headed up Baylor's Department of Biomedical Communication, they had tremendous attention to detail. They held a lot of the correspondence, the past work, and they did a lot of specific research. So it was a trait of that entire family.
He was drafted, to go into the service in the Army. He said, I came over with my parents, and I owe it to my country to serve in the Army. And so he joined, and they sent him to the Surgeon General's office, where he worked with the Surgeon General. And of course, he was in Europe and the United States, etc. But this was a very important time in his life, because at the time that he was in there, he worked on the VA hospital, the National Library of Medicine. He was on the commission for heart, cancer, and stroke for President Johnson, and any number of things. And at the same time, he had the clinical practice that we were witness of here in Houston. And he was the chairman of the Department of Surgery, the chairman or the counselor of the medical school. And all of this was going on at the same time. So it's enough that one person could just keep up with each little activity, but he was able to do that. And at the end of his serving in the Army, they asked him to stay over, and he stayed a year over to keep working on the VA hospital and some other projects that they were working on.
And the thing is that in 1942, he was only 34 years old.
Right.
So he was 34 years old when he undertook these very serious roles, and I was wondering if all that exposure in the European theater to what was going on with the casualties might have increased his intensity and seriousness about life, too.
I think he had that intensity before. If you go before that time, when he and Alton Ochsner were writing papers, he would get a accounting sheet, a large accounting sheet, and there he would do his correlations and have every reference that existed in the literature around the world in every language. And some of those articles contained 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 references. This is prior to the electronic capability of searching the literature. All of this was done through the library, and long hours in the library, long nights searching that material. So he was doing that intense kind of searching even before he went to the Surgeon General's office.
Gentlemen, I would now like to bring up several topics and get a fast response sort of statement that each of you might have about Dr. DeBakey in these areas. As you mentioned, Ken, Dr. DeBakey just had multiple areas of focus that he was able to do, each one in a spectacular fashion. But let me bring up these topics and ask each of you to give us a one-sentence thought about each one. First, Dr. DeBakey is a surgeon.
He was an excellent surgeon. He had his plan for his operation, knew the ins and outs of the operation, and was able to do things. His operations, he says, is like playing the piano. You got to, be practicing. You got to do it well, and you got to keep it up. And that's the way he was with his operations.
Ken?
He loved to operate, and he was singularly focused on what he was doing, and he expected everyone else to be the same.
Well, he was a gifted surgeon with a great deal of skill, and he knew his anatomy, and he knew his plan of attack and whatever surgical procedure needed to be done.
The next, as an educator, I know it's been said many times that somehow people occasionally thought he might be a stern educator. Would y'all comment on that?
Well, no.
He was never stern with you, was he, George?
He's stern with everybody. You could close your eyes and say, who's he talking to? Jimmy Howell, George Noon, Charlie McCollum, Ken.
Ken, what would your comment be on that?
Dr. DeBakey would educate on a specific item that he was focused on, but he surrounded himself with other educators that he turned over a lot of the mechanics of the American Board of Surgery, the American College of Surgeons, the RRCs, particularly George Jordan for general surgery, Arthur Bell for thoracic surgery. So he had as an educator, he had a knack in getting the right other educator to do the details. The High School for the Health Profession, he helped find the right principal for that school here in Houston. So part of his education was having the ability to find an individual who could accomplish the details of that task.
Charlie?
Well, education had been such a strong part of his childhood and bringing up, and he was very committed to education. I don't recall him being personally involved in doing a lot of things with the residents, but I served as his program director in general surgery for 23 years, and I can tell you that he was very interested in being sure we were getting the right recruits and giving them the right training and turning out good product.
Yeah, let's talk for a moment briefly about some of his key inventions. The first being the roller pump. George?
He didn't know it was going to be as important as it turned out to be. And actually, what happened was there was a research that was going on, and the principal investigator needed a pump that would produce pulsatility. And so he sent him to the library to try and to find out, if there was anything available. And he looked in the medical libraries first, and there wasn't anything there. Then they said, why don't you go check with engineering? So he went to engineering. And finally, he came up with a design with the roller pump and the tubing, et cetera, that was adequate in producing the pulsatility that they wanted from an experiment. And then from that, they went into blood transfusion because they were doing from blood transfusion from one patient to another. And so they'd hook it up and roll the roller pump, and there was a tachometer on the roller pump so they could tell how many revolutions per minute they were pumping, and they could stop it when they got to a point that they'd taken enough blood. When he went to Europe and was with Kirchner in Heidelberg, he had a pump over there, and he told me, over 1,000 transfusions while he was there.
Wow.
And then, of course, with John Gibbon in his cardiopulmonary bypass and the utilization of the roller pump.
It's not mentioned very often, but the roller pump had to be crucial in hemodialysis.
Right. Of course, there wasn't a whole lot of hemodialysis back then.
But later, it certainly proved to be an important part. Ken, do you want to make any comments on the roller pump?
I think George has covered it. The main invention Dr. DeBakey made was crimping on the tubing so that it didn't move along, and in not moving along did not destroy the blood. And blood banking put that on hold for a while until he and Gibbon had a discussion at the American Surgical.
John?
One thing I would add is that he was very proud of the fact that he figured out he needed to go the engineering literature, not the medical literature. And that's where he found this article on what was already been described before.
Well, let me just say something. I mean, he's talking about being proud of it. When Dr. DeBakey was recovering from his surgery, he was in the hospital for a period of time. And a lot of people would come in, and he'd get tired of talking to people, and so he'd play like actually play possum. So you didn't know whether he's awake or not. And so they found one of his roller pumps on eBay and were able to get it, and they brought it up to his room, and they were talking to him for a while, and Dr. DeBakey was just there, to sleep. And then they said, Dr. DeBakey, we've got one of your original roller pumps that we found on eBay, and he jumped up, sat on the side of the bed, and gave him a 20-minute lecture about how to put the needles in, how to roll the pump, etc. So yeah, he was proud of that invention.
Needless to say, I don't think any of us could consider doing vascular surgery without using the DeBakey instruments, particularly the DeBakey forceps with the atraumatic grip, jaws, the aneurysm clamp, hundreds, maybe thousands of other instruments. I thought before yesterday that these instruments were made in conjunction with one of the standard companies, companies. But it turns out that's not the case. Ken, do you want to speak to that?
Well, Lou Feldman was a gifted individual who did not have a biomedical or a engineering degree, who in the Baylor machine shops adapted a lot of Dr. DeBakey's ideas. And someone else may have been doing some of the same thing. Remember, at this time, spring clamps did not exist, and there was changes in metallurgy. The tips of pickups and the tips of vascular clamps did not exist. So I saw adaptations occur during my medical school and residency years, and I would see Dr. DeBakey look at the way a clamp curved, the way it fit, the way it slipped and needed to be able to be non-moving. And those adaptations were made, and then next week he would bring a new clamp into the operating room that Lou Feldman had designed. And many of those became instruments of various companies, including the ones that later claimed that they started them. So I don't know exactly where the start was. I know there was lots of adaptation that was occurring in those days.
One of the things that you're really speaking to now, Ken, is the fact that Dr. DeBakey could interact with other people, other experts, so smoothly and effectively. You're saying that he would have an idea, and this other engineer, if you will, could come up with these things. I'm impressed with the fact that he was able, with the roller pump, with the instruments, interact with other people so successfully.
The original Dacron graphs were smooth, and he found a company that in, I think, Philadelphia, that crimped those graphs, and so that they would have some simulants of pulsations during the heartbeats. So even dealing with clothing manufacturers and people who could make instruments that created the crimping was an example of such.
He had worked with Dacron in sheets that he purchased originally.
Yes.
How did that all go? With the sewing machine and the Dacron.
Well, remember, at this time there were several centers in the United States that began to use this new material called plastics, and plastics originally were invented to make a substitute for the ivory billiard balls. And I think there was a prize of $10,000 or something to the winner. Plastics began, and Orlon and nylon were some of the popular plastics that were used for vascular grafts. Dr. DeBakey wanted some of that material and literally went down to Sears.
Actually, it was Foley's.
Foley's department store?
He went to a local department store and he asked the sales lady for some Orlon and nylon, and she said, "We're fresh out of that." And she said, "But this other material has just come in, nobody will buy it, they don't know what it is, it's Dacron." So he bought some, and he actually then fabricated a tube graft from that material that he had bought from that department store.
Did he collaborate at all with, I think it was Art Voorhees, who had Vignon at that same time?
I don't know how much those individuals talked to each other, or how much they heard and read from those early meetings. But there was a lot of competition at that time.
What about his background in seamstress work? That's an interesting part.
His mother in Lake Charles taught all the girls of the neighborhood when he was very young to crochet and to sew and to use a new gadget she had called a sewing machine. And he was young at that time, and he observed what was going on and learned from her how to use the sewing machine and the importance of stitching.
George, you have something to add?
Just came to my mind about Dr. DeBakey and the billiard balls. He mentioned the billiard.
Yes.
Well, Dr. DeBakey and his brother were both very good pool players. In fact, his brother was a pool shark.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
He made money at it.
And he made money at it. And so DeBakey every now and then would write home and say, "I need some extra money to do this, the other thing." They'd say, "Well, how come your brother never writes to us, you know?" And so he said, "I can't tell them they were pool sharks." He thought for a minute, says, "I guess he can manage money better than we can." But another time with billiard balls, when we were up there with Yeltsin, we went to the home of the Minister of Health, and during the meal, the surgeons would disappear from time to time, and we found out there were two things that they were disappearing for. One was to go smoke a cigarette, and the other was to play pool. And they had a pool table down in his basement, so Dr. DeBakey went down there and was standing around the pool table, and they were looking at him, and they said, "Well, what would be nice to Dr. DeBakey? We'll invite him to play." So he said, "Yeah, I'll do it." And so he emptied the table. I mean, just boom, 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 boom. And so, as we'd say in Texas, he kicked their ass.
Let's talk a little bit. Let's go back to when Dr. DeBakey was a surgeon in the Surgeon General's office. It's well known that his idea resulted in the formation of mass units, which saved hundreds, probably thousands of lives of young soldiers by bringing the surgical units up closer to the front lines. But also, which is little discussed, is the registry that he helped form World War II injuries and published on that, and also a very little known publication that I came in contact with in the research lab was his cold injury article, which defined the fact that most casualties in World War II and in the Korean War were due to cold injury, which had never been described before. I was just stunned by the fact that no matter where you looked, anytime I got ready to look at something in depth, whether it was a colon injuries in World War II or cold injuries or the mass units, anytime I would try to research something in the lab, the person who had done was most involved was Dr. DeBakey. How do you think that happened? How do you think that he formed the basis of the Veterans Administration hospitals? How do you think these things happened?
Well, I think he had a very strong sense of well-being for the veterans coming back to the States, and he could see a problem that we didn't have the facilities to take care of them, and so he was a big, strong advocate of the VA system. In fact, the hospital that became the VA hospital was the U.S. Naval Hospital during World War II, and because of his contacts in Washington, I remember him telling me one time that he got a call from a friend of his in Washington telling him that President Truman had decided to convert that Navy hospital to a VA hospital, and asked Dr. DeBakey if he thought Baylor would be interested in staffing it. And he said, "Yes, I think would like to do that." And he said, "Well, when do you think you could do that?" And he said, "Well, how about in the morning?"
Well, I think this is an outgrowth of his time with Dr. Matas and Dr. Oshner on the need for data. All of these gentlemen, and it was popular at Tulane at the time, you can't make a decision without evidence-based, long before we use evidence-based now. So you look at his articles back then, you look at the articles from World War II, he collected data in order to have evidence to analyze and statistically apply. If you look at one of the largest papers out of the Second World War, it's his paper on vascular injuries. And they're almost all peripheral vascular injuries. And he talks about prostheses, he talks about sympathectomy, he talks about heparinization, many of those things that lasted another 40 years. And we can go back to that article and the principles based upon data, focused on data, began there. So you ask, what was the etiology? I think it was his desire for data.
Let's speak for a moment now about Dr. DeBakey as a medical statesman, which is rarely discussed, yet he had relationships with LBJ and so many other important politicians that shape, and we're finding out even today, that shape our medical system and medical care system. Comment for us, George, about Dr. DeBakey as a medical statesman.
Well, he was amazing because he was able to do that despite everything else that he was doing in his daily practice of medicine. Every country that I went to with him, when we always met with the top echelon in the State Department and the presidents, etc. He had a knack of being able to be in contact and be to get them to support things that he was interested in pursuing. For example, the Library of Medicine. There were, at the same time, there were a lot of other things going on, but the Library of Medicine had been going through all kinds of turmoil, and he was able to get the attention of the Rayburn and some others to make some improvements in the library, or actually come up with a new library. And they had everything approved except for the location of where the library is going to be. This is under Dr. DeBakey's leadership. And his recommendation, it should be on the NIH lot. There were two places that were up for grabs. One was with Fishbein in Chicago, and he had a lot of support to move it to Chicago. But they asked Dr. DeBakey if he knew anybody in Texas that could get Sam Rayburn to approve it to move to the NIH. And he realized or thought that he had operated on the husband of the secretary of the Democratic Convention, and called her up, and she was appreciative of his operation, and her husband was doing fine. And she talked to Rayburn, and the next day they came in and they said, "I don't know what you did, Dr. DeBakey, but we got it settled."
I remember the tape
Yeah.
that we did. The whole story was told by DeBakey.
Yeah.
Roger, I'd like to add something about his statesmanship.
Great.
He, because of his contacts through medicine, he had friends in Russia and China, and was visiting there throughout the Cold War. And I remember one time he was going to China, and he went to Washington, D.C. to be briefed on what to expect. After he spent a week or so in China, he came back through Washington to be debriefed. And the ideal concept was that he was seeing more than our CIA and foreign intelligence stuff like could gather, so they wanted him to bring back information. So, he was an envoy for the United States to behind the Iron Curtain long before any diplomatic relationships were made.
How did he develop the friendships with the Russians?
Well, the friendship in Russia started in a medical meeting in Mexico City, and he saw a group of doctors over in the corner somewhere, and he went over and visited with them, and they were from Moscow, and he spent some time in visiting with them, and then asked them to come by Houston on the way back, and they did, and then that led to all the things that George knows more about than I do, but I mean, it was that contact.
They were personal contacts
Yeah,
from
yeah.
long ago.
He was quick to reach out, which amazed me. He had a way of interacting and connecting with people that I found to be amazing.
The National Library of Medicine has a program where it was the students that they have roving around the United States. And they were here at a meeting in Houston with there were about 600 high school students that were over where the old Shamrock building used to be. And they were having this meeting, and about halfway through, Dr. DeBakey was coming, and that's when he was in his wheelchair. hadn't gained the strength back. So they rolled him into the room with all those students, and all of a sudden the students jumped up. They started yelling and screaming and running up to him. They wanted his autograph, and they hugging and kissing, and it was just like a rock star. I mean, just amazing. I've never seen anything like that before.
It is little known that in this international diplomacy, long before globalism, Dr. DeBakey opened up the Middle East by going to Israel, to Lebanon. Remember, his family came from Lebanon. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and in many of the countries of the Middle East, they all knew that he was a friend of the other countries, but they actually utilized that in talking to each other. He also brought from those countries, at a time when you were here as a fellow, Dr. Gregory, many of the highly recommended surgeons of those countries to come here to learn vascular surgery. This was the place to learn vascular surgery. Those individuals went back as the leading surgeon of that country. And you can name numerous countries in Greece, in Iran, in Israel, in Saudi Arabia. And so that opened up the global surgical concepts long before other places brought them up. With 9/11, there was a tightening of international fellows to come, and that program is not as vigorous as it was prior to 9/11.
Now, another one of Dr. DeBakey's gigantic roles was that of a builder, particularly with the Baylor College of Medicine. It's amazing to me that when Dr. DeBakey came, that he had no faculty, no house staff, no teaching hospital, and yet somehow he understood and was able to form relationships and start and begin with Baylor that's ended up in this. I know Ken took us on a tour yesterday. It was like going through a city of what's happened to the medical center now, all as a result of Dr. DeBakey coming with nothing here, and yet he was able to build this gigantic medical center. I wouldn't say single-handedly, but certainly he had a hand in everything that's happened. How do you think that happened, George?
I think that the medical center was being developed at the time that he came over here, from in 1948. And as you say, he built it from nothing. In fact, he was ready to go back to New Orleans and just leave this to somebody else. When Dr. Ochsner convinced him to stay, and that's when the VA hospital situation came in, and they moved the Naval Hospital converting into a VA hospital affiliated with a school. And that kept him here. And then he was able to build up services in the City County Hospital, and the Methodist Hospital. He did his primary surgery was opened up in 1952. And that's where he did most of his cardiac and vascular surgery.
At that same time, he was frustrated with those in the city who were not board certified, who may have been jealous of him, did not let him on the staff at Herman Hospital. He wanted to go back to New Orleans. He called Alston Ochsner, who said, "Go talk to Mr. Ben Taub," who was the supervisor of the City County Hospital at the time, which was Jefferson Davis over on Allen Parkway. He asked for 5 minutes of Mr. Taub's time and walked into Mr. Taub's office, and on his office desk was the Flexner report. And Dr. DeBakey said, "I see you have the Flexner report." Ben Taub said something to the effect, yes, it says something about association with medical schools improving quality. And Dr. DeBakey said something to the effect, yes, that's on page 145, line 37. And they opened it up, and sure enough, there it was. And they then spent 5 hours, not 5 minutes, becoming long hard friends. The Taub family, the Taub Foundation became an early contributor to many of the surgical programs. And so Mr. Taub had a lot to do with not only helping the department, but building other things in the Texas Medical Center. So part of this building, the city was ready, the politics were ready, the money was ready, the humanitarians of the town were ready, and it was receptive to the faculty that came to Baylor, including Dr. DeBakey, and there were others like Dean Morrison that were really dedicated to making what you see here now possible. And Dr. DeBakey was a major part of that growth.
I'm going to edit the tape. One of the one of the questions is, should we say anything more about DeBakey and Cooley's conflict and all these stories? Should we
try us? You can ask us each a question, and we each have some things to say that are good for the tape.
What do you think? Should we revisit the whole thing, or?
Well, it's real life, something that happened, and they're not censored.
They worked together for many years.
The program started in the 50s, working on assist devices, the left ventricular assist devices and total artificial hearts. And Ken has a pretty good narration of what went on at that time. But they developed a heart that looked like it would work satisfactorily, and decided to put it with the Mingo Leota to implant it in a patient. And so Cooley had this patient had a ventricular aneurysm that he knew before he operated wasn't going to make it. And anyway, the patient didn't survive without having had the pump implanted, so they had to develop this pump in the laboratories, unknown to Dr. DeBakey. At least he says he never knew about it. Or they had the drivers and the prostheses, etc. So they put the heart in this carp and then took it out in a few days and with a transplant, and the patient died of a sepsis. They asked Dr. Cooley, I actually asked him one time, I said, you know, you got in a lot of trouble with that. And he said, yeah, that's for sure. And I said, why didn't you ask permission, to do the operation? He said, because I know what they would have said. No. And so it ended up being the first bridge to transplant support in history, which he did. But he had suffered some consequences from doing that. But Dr. DeBakey just had a distrust for him because of that, which I think at the end he I guess forgave him. What do you think, Ken?
We ought to separate two issues. One is the operation on the patient at St. Luke's, and second is the issue that you brought up, feud. First off, in the early 1950s, Dr. DeBakey recruited Dr. Cooley to be on the faculty. He told me several times that Dr. Cooley could write well, had a good mind, and they spent weekends in their offices on a table much like this doing papers, and they had many papers together. So there was that respect. Both of them were very aggressive, and it is natural that surgeons doing similar kind of pioneering work are competitive with each other and drive each other to new records. That was occurring even before the transplant and the artificial heart era. The left ventricular assist device and the total heart was developed with an NIH grant and developed in the Baylor laboratories and put in several calves, none of whom lived more than a few hours. So it was still being modified, at which time transplantation occurred So the laboratories were used to develop transplantation skills prior to using them in people. And Domenico Leota did not have his laboratories. He was offered the use of the laboratories at St. Luke's, and he naively moved his work over there and started working with Dr. Cooley, who was not a co-investigator on that NIH grant. It was then put in a person prior to successful use in animals and without permission from NIH. Baylor had a lot of other grants, and Dr. Cooley was ultimately sanctioned by the American College of Surgeons, and he resigned from Baylor, and had he continued that work, it would have jeopardized all of the other basic science and other NIH work. So there are some issues here that relate to the logistics of NIH. But surgeons, if they have a gadget that they think is going to save someone's life, often will push the envelope. The valves inside that heart put in Haskell carp were different valves and were originally placed in the Baylor laboratory, but not that much difference. The lining, the pump, the engineering, and on was pretty much the same pump. Domenico Leota has subsequently in an article stated that. So there were the issues of the rules of NIH that have to be addressed by any IRB of any institution, and those were addressed, and that resulted in Dr. Cooley not being a member of the faculty at Baylor. Ultimately, the three of us were involved in bringing Dr. DeBakey and Dr. Cooley back together, and we can talk about some of those details. But at that meeting, Dr. Cooley said something to the effect, "Dr. DeBakey, I'm glad we're back together and the feud is over." Dr. DeBakey immediately chided him and said, "Dr. Cooley, in my view, there was never, ever any feud." And during those years, quite honestly, I never heard Dr. DeBakey say one word about derogatory about Dr. Cooley. And what we used to bring them together was to say, long distance runners in a marathon race drive each other to set new records. And Dr. DeBakey, it's time you recognize Dr. Cooley for being your pacer. Dr. Cooley, it's time you recognize Dr. DeBakey as pacing you to setting new records. And both of them said, let's do it. And it was done within, just a few weeks after that.
I would agree it should be part of it because it's part of history and it's part of DeBakey. And, you can modify it in such a way, but it should be there.
But after that, I got a letter from Lois DeBakey complaining about Cooley's new book called The Thousand Hearts.
We will talk about what we know of directly. Dr. Cooley is free to write what he writes, as is any writer, and we can tell you what happened with our eyes at meetings where the two of them met. At a DeBakey Society meeting here in Houston, they met together, they had lunch together. There was a table of 12, and nobody else at that table of 12 could even get in a word edgewise. These two surgeons were like two golfers at the end of the 18th hole talking about all of their good shots, their bad shots, and were absolutely consumed in this discussion.
Let me ask another question about the faculty at Baylor that Dr. DeBakey was able to develop. It's always been a question in my mind, how in the world did Dr. DeBakey keep such a spectacular staff? George Morris, Stanley Crawford, Ed Garrett, Jimmy Frank Howell, George Jordan, Art Bell. And I would add also to that list Maddox, Noon, McCullough. Now, some did leave. Ted Dietrich, Ed Garrett, primarily because of illness, I would think. B.W. Haynes, but most stayed. Why? When other opportunities were certainly there for this spectacular staff, how was he able to get the faculty that he had developed to stay? What do you think, Charlie?
First of all, the faculty was the most stable department in surgery up through the mid-'80s. I mean, of all the names you stated, and many of them had an opportunity to become chairman elsewhere.
Sure.
But I think they all had a comfortable relationship and were satisfied with what they were doing and being properly rewarded in many ways, and couldn't find anything that offered a better opportunity.
This management style could make a book for any chairman of any company, any department, be it oil, be it medical school or whatever. Dr. DeBakey allowed independence on the part of each of these individuals. He allowed them to develop their own program under an umbrella of overriding governing principles. And if somebody from the outside criticized, he was always supportive, extremely supportive. Now, he may call you into his office and say, "What in the world have you just done?" But when someone else was trying to hurt you or to change you or to criticize your program, he was supportive and say, I led them into that. That is a key that doesn't occur in many programs. Often a rising star is not sure whether they're liked or not, whether or not they're accepted or not, or whether or not they're supported or not, and then often are getting criticisms that cause them to leave.
Richard, you
Yeah, if you don't mind, I have one or two questions. It's kind of nostalgic because my mentor, and I trained under Tom Royster, who was here with you all. And then when I was fortunate to be able to write a few papers towards the end of my training on aorta iliac disease and all the results where we were at Roosevelt and what have you, those cards that we had to use when we were on the vascular service, they obviously must have come from here. There were these cards that after every operation, we had to fill them out, or Dr. Royster filled them out, and he learned that here, because I asked him, how did that whole card thing get started? As I'm holding one of Dr. DeBakey's pencils.
Well, it's talked about his medical records were just absolutely unique. As was mentioned a little bit yesterday, after the arteriogram, pre-op arteriogram was done, we'd sit down in his office and he would draw the findings of the arteriogram. And then the next day when the patient had the surgery, he would make another drawing and draw what the surgery had done. And for chronic patients that came back and back, it was a history of vascular surgery. I mean, they'd have aorta iliac and carotid and this and that and the other. And I think the card started though because, well, I know at one time he was still over here and his office was still over here. And he would actually come back to the office and put those drawings on. When I was a second-year resident, he said, "Well, why don't you make out and draw these for me?" And I did it for about 3 days. He said, "You don't know what you're doing. I've got to do it myself." But I always thought, and I tried to get our residents to do that time and time again, and you just couldn't get them to do it. I don't know many vascular surgeons that do that today.
But it was fascinating as I reflect back to 1975 and 6 when I compiled the data looking over 200-300 cases long before computers. That system really worked because it had the pre-op, post-op, the date, and it was incredible.
The key was it was in your office. It was in Dr. DeBakey's office. He had a frustration with centralized medical records. And like all of us, you can't get those records out of medical records easily, and they're always off somewhere. So this drawing, this card, this chart was a way of having a shadow chart that was in your hands, immediately available to the surgeon at the location where the surgeon was doing their records.
I have one other quick question. How did he relate to the whole endovascular EVAR explosion and Dr. Perotti's, paradigm change? Was he open-minded about it?
If I have a major observation of our department, is that we started early, we developed a lot of the open procedures, and most of the names that were mentioned by Dr. Gregory predated the endovascular explosion. Dr. DeBakey predated it more than the others. So we did not recruit faculty who were interested in endovascular until long after it was established in the country. So the volume of work was such that it almost appeared subconsciously to the faculty that this is going to go on forever. And let's watch that and adopt it when it comes. And then it exploded so quickly, we didn't have a faculty in place. So I might be a little critical of us for not developing faculty who were aggressive in developing it. You might have different views.
True about the faculty, but he was very supportive of it. He saw that it was something that was going to be feasible, reliable, and get good results from. And I can see him up in his office looking and talking to some of the people about the endovascular procedures, and he was very supportive of it.
But we did not do it here early.
That's right.
I had the opportunity to visit the Gore shop out in Flagstaff one time, I guess in the 90s sometime, and they, did all this kind of stuff, and they were having the study on the aortic endografts, and they filled up that, but they were still trying to get places that were going to thoracic aortic aneurysm, and I said, well, I just volunteered Baylor for it, and I had to come back and talk to Dr. DeBakey about it, and he was very supportive together. He brought Joe Caselli and Hassam Safi in, and we had a big discussion, and they were our people that did it for our department. We didn't participate in it very much, as a matter of fact, but he was very supportive. I mean, he recognized things like that. I mean, he could see what was going on.
I do a lot of carotid endarterectomy operations, and I was obviously so interested that he had done the first one. Do you remember him talking about that and the details of that?
Well, it was a patient from Louisiana that had TIAs that they did the operation on, and then they did a no patch in primary closure, and it worked okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an obvious concept.
It
But it wasn't obvious to others.
It was soon after that. I was a medical student, and I was fascinated with a gadget that was ancillary to the operation. And that was a flow meter that he had gone to the laboratory and developed. And they would measure flow prior to putting on the clamps, measure then flow. I think it was in the common carotid artery he measured the flow.
I mean, it was an internal product.
But it
Should have been the internal.
and so I was fascinated that in order to prove his point, he developed a new instrument to do that. Now, I don't know if the flow meter really measured that kind of flow, but the papers showed a difference.
Charlie, talk to us about, I know you mentioned to me that on the telephone the other day, you mentioned that you had 3 phases in your relationship with Dr. DeBakey. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, I thought about that a lot. Of course, we all had the same initial phase. As residents, and early on the faculty, you were terrified. You were going to you'd be accused of lack of attention to detail or not paying attention or this and that and the other. And that lasted a long time. And then there was a intermediate phase that I sort of felt like that he accepted me in the operating room. And, that was when he would frequently come in the operating room and assist me. And that was, a great deal of pride when that happened, because you kind of felt you had arrived. And later on, I don't know whether it's because he was getting older and mellower, but I felt we really became friends, and had some social activities and things, and he was really very enjoyable. A lot of fun to be with.
I had a fourth phase with Dr. DeBakey, and that started in 1958 when I was a college student and came to Houston for a Texas Academy of Medicine. I had a paper on then, and in 1959 when I came as a medical student, the same incident happened on both those visits. I was in one of the lecture halls when somebody drove up outside this building that's right next to us, left their car running in a special parking place, came into their office and worked, and I didn't know who this was at the time. I didn't know who Dr. DeBakey. This was Dr. DeBakey. He had his office that I showed you yesterday. That was his original office. The Jewish building office had not yet been built. And then they showed us some movies of Dr. DeBakey and said, that was Dr. DeBakey who left his car running so he doesn't waste time when he finishes his work here and goes back to Methodist Hospital to do his clinical work. And I thought, my goodness, that's really preserving time, and what kind of individual keeps their car running
At the same time.
later I learned. I saw the movies that they were making at that time, and even at that time, the internists who were on the admissions committee, the dean of students, Jim Schofield, they were kind of contemptuous of Dr. DeBakey because of his unique work efforts and his pushing his time. Thought he was egocentric, and so that was my first phase with Dr. DeBakey.
George, let me ask you this question. I'll have to interject something about the life of a famous Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. Do you think Dr. DeBakey was the Thomas Jefferson of medicine? A true Renaissance man?
I think so.
I think that's pretty clear. Have you ever heard Dr. DeBakey compared to Thomas Jefferson?
This morning.
Charlie, you think that's a fair comparison?
Absolutely. And he was the most famous physician in the world
Oh, yeah,
during the height of his career. I mean,
absolutely.
and it was somewhere was mentioned, if you go foreign trip. I remember in Frankfurt one time, we were having a meeting. First thing the mayor found out, the DeBakey Society was meeting over there and wanted to have an audience with him down on the city square.
Do you guys think he should get the Nobel Prize?
You have to be alive to receive that, I think.
The answer is yes, but then there was disagreement on actually 2 or 3 times on what he should get it for. Should it be on vascular surgery? Should it be on his work with cardiac assist? Should it be on his monumental work on hepatic abscesses? And should it be on his work with Ochsner on the on lung cancer? It could have come from a number of areas. I think the mistake of those who nominated him was they didn't focus on one of these rather than sort of mix it up, because I think he could have gotten it for any one. There is one of his faculty that he recruited did get the Nobel Prize. It is out there in the museum. We did not look at it yesterday specifically. I think there is something that we ought to have for the film. One of you asked me what drove Dr. DeBakey early. I think it was his desire to have a surgical approach to atherosclerosis, or a surgical approach to cardiovascular disease. Remember in 1948, when he came to Houston, the treatment for atherosclerosis and the treatment for heart disease was bed rest and sympathectomy.
That was it.
That was it. So developing a surgical approach to cardiovascular disease was, I think, his singular beginning driving vision upon which everything else was built.
I think we can stay here, talk until tomorrow. And I think it's time that we have to say goodbye. And I'd like to thank everybody, especially Joanne and Mary Ellen. It's been wonderful experience for us to learn all this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for doing it.